The Engineer's Track. Built nearly 2 centuries ago, it stretched some 65 kilometres along the spine of the Grose Valley, from the Nepean in the east to the Darling Causeway in the west. But why was it built, and who were these engineers? I've walked plenty of tracks across the Blue Mountains over the years, but if there's one that's beaten me, it's this one. Back in 2021, I tackled its western end without a hitch. Overgrown in parts, sure, and I lost the track a few times, but I made it through to the base of Ikara Head. My most recent attempt in 2026 for this video didn't go as planned. A combination of factors and a gut feeling saw me turn around. Frustrating, but sometimes the mountains make that call for you. The idea of a track threading through the Grose Valley dates back to the late 1850s, when routes for a railway across the mountains were still being explored. A 25-year-old Edwin Barton had been in the colony for a year before he scored the role of assistant engineer, in charge of trial surveys for the railways. Barton had already explored the length of the Grose Valley, and in his mind it was a very doable route for a future railway. Run a line from Yarramundi at the edge of Sydney's Western Plains, up the winding Grose River Valley, tunnel beneath the Darling Causeway and emerge at Hartley Vale. Sounds easy, right? Well, anyone that knows this terrain also knows he was dreaming. Enter the engineers. By 1835, Sydney was starting to see contingents of Royal Engineers, a corps of the British Army, specifically sent out from Britain to carry out work on projects that were sometimes poorly handled by local private contractors. Repairs on roads and bridges, works on Cockatoo Island, and the construction of Circular Quay, to name a few. In 1856, one such group relocated from Tassie to Parramatta, and by the following year they got cracking carving a bridle track along the Grose. The purpose wasn't transport, at least not yet. This track was to make way for surveyors to get in to survey the proposed route of the railway. It can be brutal country, steep, tangled, unforgiving, and it was no easy task. Progress meant cutting through rock, felling timber, building embankments, laying culverts, and throwing together rough timber bridges. Around 10 surveyors and 50 labourers were set to the task. Hard, back-breaking work when the conditions were favourable, but when the rains hit, so did a flooding river. Bush camps were set up en route, and they would have had minimal supplies and absolutely no comfort. A variety of hand tools had to be carried, even explosives. It was a pretty tough gig. While surveying was still very much underway in 1859, a 28-year-old Robert Hunt, scientist and amateur colonial photographer, had already photographed many parts of Sydney. He joined the crews in the valley, taking snaps of the goings-on and getting a real taste of what was happening there. These were some of the first wilderness photographs in the world. The task of surveying 65 kilometres of rugged wilderness was nothing short of enormous, and even then, doubts were creeping in. Barton himself admitted to a parliamentary committee that the route was rugged, and the only difficulty he could see was having to construct tunnels and viaducts due to sharp river bends. Chief Commissioner for Railways, Captain Benjamin Martindale, visited the Lower Grose in early 1859. I imagine it was then that he realised how mammoth the project actually was, and he then initiated work to commence from the Darling Causeway in the west. The plan being to have both sides of construction meet and finish somewhere in the middle. But the writing was already on the wall. A ton of work already went into the project, and a lot of money. But before any sleepers or rails were ever laid, the idea was canned in 1860. It was never going to work as a railway route. By the 1870s, much of the track was already in disrepair or completely washed away from flooding in the eastern Grose Valley. Though its surviving sections were still being used by cattlemen and walkers, and it was still one of the few isolated tracks used to avoid the Colonial toll gates. In 1875, Frederick Eccleston Dufour, chief draftsman at the Department of Lands, often explored the Blue Mountains from the land he owned at Mount Wilson. It was here that he entertained friends like photographer Joseph Bischoff and landscape painter William Piggany, organising expeditions to spend time down in the valley. They used the same track we're on right now, following it down and setting up camp where Govert's Creek meets Grose River, near Blue Gum Forest. It's here that Bischoff took many shots of the valley, and Piggany produced stunning paintings and sketches. The track today is all but gone. From the Nepean through to Burra Carrain, the old track was either washed away or taken out in landslips. Any track relics above the floodline are likely to be in ruin or barely recognisable. The most accessible section begins near the Darling Causeway. Park on Canyon Colliery Trail before the rail line and follow the rail service track southwest. This is where the track vanishes and you're relying on GPS while ploughing through long grasses, bracken and 3-metre high saplings. If you're lucky, you'll stumble across this small stone cairn marking the way. It's an easy downhill traverse above the gully, with Surveyor's Creek to your left. A good eye is a bonus, not just for any potential snakes snoozing on the track, but you'll start to notice small stone embankments, a culvert and pick marks on the rocks. They're very easy to overlook. Almost a kilometre in and you're standing on top of a rock overhanging the bracken-filled creek gully. It's here that you'll see evidence of blasting, and below it is an imposing stone retaining wall. Further on, a survey mark etched into the stone. A little further along and things were getting a tad challenging. Tall bracken and clumps of saw edge formed a virtual wall, and within it all was long grass and boggy mud. Rub against that saw edge the wrong way and it's like walking through razors. My arms are already bleeding from scratches. An attempt to find a way around it resulted in sliding down the slope to the creek. There was no way further. 5 years ago, this all looked very different. It was a year after the 2020 fires swept through, so regrowth was barely 12 months old. This wall of bush then was probably waist high. It was getting late in the day, the light was dimming, and defeat was declared. Somehow I even had a blowout. Time to get out of here. Thanks, Engineer's Track. It was nice. Bloody hell. A few days later, I returned to the Upper Grose, this time hitting up a car ahead track for a distant view of the Engineer's Track. This one's a very easy walk along the ridge top, ending at a car ahead. It's from up here you get a sense of the scale of this sprawling river valley, vast and rugged.
Colors in my head, dishes in the kitchen sink.
The Engineer's Track feels like a quiet reminder of ambition meeting its limits. A fragile line scratched into a landscape that had no intention of keeping it. For a brief moment, it carried the weight of big ideas and hard labour, before the valley slowly took it back. What remains gives you a sense of how small those early efforts were against something this incredibly vast.
I'm not one of the young anymore. Time's got me down. If this is meant to be, then why am I spinning out? Walking on